Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most captivating stories from early Christian history. Have you ever wondered what happened to Jesus' closest followers after his crucifixion? The 12 apostles who walked with Jesus, learned from him, and witnessed his miracles. What became of them? How did their incredible journeys end? This is a story that has fascinated historians, believers, and curious minds for nearly 2,000 years. These 12 ordinary men became extraordinary messengers who changed the world forever. But their paths after Jesus' death were filled with danger, courage, and ultimate sacrifice. Today, we'll explore the final chapters of each apostle's life. Some of these stories might surprise you, others might inspire you, and a few might even shock you. From crucifixions to beheadings, from peaceful deaths to brutal martyrdoms, each apostle's ending tells us something powerful about their faith and dedication. Before we begin this incredible journey through history, I want you to think about this. Which apostle's story do you think will surprise you the most? Drop your guess in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing historical content. Now, let's step back in time and discover the truth behind the final days of the 12 apostles. 1. Simon Peter, the rock who died upside down. Let's start with Simon Peter, the man Jesus called the Rock. Peter was the bold, sometimes impulsive fisherman who became the leader of the early church. But how did this passionate follower of Jesus meet his end? The Bible doesn't give us the exact details of Peter's death, but church tradition tells us an amazing story. According to these ancient accounts, Peter was crucified in Rome, just like his master Jesus. But here's the incredible part: Peter was crucified upside down. Why upside down? The story goes that when Peter was sentenced to death, he made a special request. He told his executioners that he wasn't worthy to die in the same way as Jesus. Peter remembered how he had denied knowing Jesus 3 times during Jesus' trial, and this guilt weighed heavily on his heart. So he asked to be crucified with his head pointing toward the ground. This wasn't just tradition making up stories. Jesus himself had predicted Peter's death years earlier. In the Gospel of John, Jesus told Peter, "When you were young, you dressed yourself and walked wherever you wanted. But when you are old, someone else will dress you and lead you where you don't want to go." Jesus was preparing Peter for the kind of death he would face. The phrase "stretch out your hands" that Jesus used was actually a way of describing crucifixion. When someone was crucified, their arms were stretched out on the cross. Jesus knew that Peter would one day face this terrible death, but he also knew that Peter's death would bring glory to God. Peter lived about 34 years after Jesus made this prophecy. When the time came, Peter faced his death with courage. He had learned from his earlier mistakes and had become the strong leader Jesus knew he could be. Even though facing an upside-down crucifixion must have been terrifying, Peter found comfort in knowing that his death would honor God. Think about Peter's transformation from the man who denied Jesus to the man who died for him. That's the power of forgiveness and faith working in someone's life. 2. James the Greater, the first martyr. James, the son of Zebedee, was part of Jesus' inner circle along with Peter and his brother John. James was known for his fiery personality. He and John were even nicknamed Sons of Thunder because of their passionate nature. James has a unique place in apostolic history because he was the first apostle to be killed for his faith. And he's the only apostle whose death is actually recorded in the Bible. The book of Acts tells us that King Herod had James killed with a sword, which most likely means he was beheaded. This happened around 44 AD in Jerusalem during the early days of the Christian church. King Herod was trying to please the Jewish leaders who opposed Christianity, so he decided to persecute the apostles. James became his first target. But here's something interesting about James's legacy. While he died in Jerusalem, tradition says he had been a missionary in Spain before his death. Today, there's a famous pilgrimage route called the Camino de Santiago, the Way of Saint James, that leads to a shrine in northwestern Spain where James is supposedly buried. Every year, about 300,000 people walk this ancient path to honor James's memory. Whether or not James actually preached in Spain is debated by historians, but what's not debated is his courage. He had once asked Jesus if he and his brother could sit at Jesus' right and left hand in heaven, and Jesus asked them if they were ready to drink from the same cup of suffering he would drink. James boldly said yes, and he proved his commitment by becoming the first apostle to die for the faith. James's death showed the other apostles and early Christians what they might face, but it also showed them that it was possible to face death with courage when you truly believed in what you were dying for. 3. John, the beloved disciple who lived. John, the brother of James and the disciple whom Jesus loved, had a very different ending from his brother. While James was the first to die, John was likely the last apostle to die, and amazingly, he's believed to be the only apostle who didn't die a violent death. John's story is fascinating because he faced persecution but survived it miraculously. According to tradition, John was living in Ephesus in modern-day Turkey when he was arrested for preaching about Jesus. His enemies decided to execute him in a terrible way. They planned to boil him alive in a huge pot of oil. But here's where the story becomes incredible. When they put John in the boiling oil, he didn't die. He survived this horrible torture without being harmed. His executioners were so amazed and frightened by this miracle that they didn't know what to do with him. Instead of killing him, they decided to send him away to the island of Patmos, where he would work as a slave in the mines. Patmos was a rocky, desolate island in the Aegean Sea, used as a prison for criminals and political prisoners, but God had a plan for John's time on Patmos. It was on this lonely island that John received one of the most important visions in Christian history. Jesus appeared to him and gave him the prophecies that became the book of Revelation. This book, which talks about the end times and the final victory of good over evil, has inspired and comforted Christians for centuries. Eventually, John was released from Patmos, probably because of his old age. He returned to Ephesus and lived out his remaining years peacefully, continuing to teach and encourage other Christians. He died as an elderly man, surrounded by those who loved him. John's long life allowed him to write several books of the New Testament, including the Gospel of John and 3 letters. His peaceful death was unusual among the apostles, but it served God's purpose by allowing John to preserve Jesus' teachings for future generations. 4. Andrew, the first called, crucified on an X. Andrew holds a special place among the apostles because he was the very first person Jesus called to follow him. Andrew was Peter's brother, and like Peter, he was a fisherman. Before meeting Jesus, Andrew had been a follower of John the Baptist. Here's something beautiful about Andrew. He was the one who brought Peter to Jesus. When Andrew first met Jesus, he was so excited that he immediately went to find his brother. "We have found the Messiah," he told Peter. Because of Andrew's enthusiasm, Peter also became a disciple. Throughout the Gospels, we see Andrew often playing a supporting role to his more famous brother Peter. But Andrew had his own important moments, like when he brought the boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish to Jesus before the miracle of feeding the 5,000. Andrew's death, like Peter's, was by crucifixion, but with a unique twist. According to tradition, Andrew was killed in the Greek city of Patras around 60 AD. But instead of being crucified on a regular cross, Andrew was tied to an X-shaped cross. Why an X-shaped cross? Like Peter, Andrew felt he wasn't worthy to die in exactly the same way as Jesus, so he asked to be crucified on a different type of cross. This X-shaped cross is now known as St. Andrew's Cross, and you can see it on the flag of Scotland, where Andrew is the patron saint. The most remarkable thing about Andrew's death was his attitude. According to the ancient accounts, Andrew was tied to the cross, not nailed, and hung there for 3 whole days. During those 3 days, he continued preaching to anyone who would listen. He used his final hours to tell people about Jesus, even while he was dying. Andrew's story shows us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is introduce others to Jesus, just like he introduced Peter. His faithfulness, even unto death, reminds us that following Jesus is worth any sacrifice. 5. Philip, the practical apostle. Philip was one of the first disciples Jesus called, and he came from the same town as Peter and Andrew, Bethsaida, by the Sea of Galilee. Philip appears to have been practical and thoughtful, and he may have spoken Greek better than some of the other disciples. In the Gospels, we see Philip in several important moments. He was the one who brought Nathanael, possibly Bartholomew, to Jesus, saying, "Come and see." When some Greek visitors wanted to meet Jesus, they approached Philip first, probably because he could speak their language. Jesus also tested Philip's faith before the miracle of feeding the 5,000. He asked Philip, "Where can we buy bread to feed all these people?" Philip's practical mind immediately went to work calculating the cost, showing his logical nature. Philip is also remembered for asking Jesus, "Lord, show us the Father," to which Jesus replied, "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." This conversation reveals Philip's desire to understand deeper spiritual truths. Unfortunately, the details of Philip's death are unclear because different traditions tell different stories. Some accounts say he died peacefully of old age around 80 AD. Others say he was stoned to death, beheaded, or even crucified upside down like Peter. The uncertainty about Philip's death reminds us that many details about the apostles' lives were not carefully recorded at the time. What we do know is that Philip faithfully served Jesus in the early church, using his practical nature and language skills to spread the gospel message. Whether Philip died peacefully or as a martyr, his life shows us the importance of being practical in our faith, using our natural abilities and skills to serve God and introduce others to Jesus. 6. Bartholomew. The mystery apostle Bartholomew is one of the most mysterious apostles because we know very little about him from the Bible. His name appears in the lists of the 12 apostles, but that's about all the direct information we have. Many scholars believe that Bartholomew might be the same person as Nathanael, who appears in the Gospel of John. This theory comes from the fact that Nathanael is closely associated with Philip. In John's Gospel, while Bartholomew is often mentioned alongside Philip in the other Gospels, if Bartholomew and Nathanael are the same person, then we know a bit more about him. Nathanael was the man who initially doubted that anything good could come from Nazareth when Philip told him about Jesus. But when Jesus demonstrated supernatural knowledge about Nathanael's life, Nathanael immediately declared, "You are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." The traditions about Bartholomew's death are unfortunately very gruesome, though they vary in details. The most commonly told story is that he was flayed alive, meaning his skin was slowly peeled off his body and then beheaded. This horrible method of execution was sometimes used by the Romans and other ancient peoples. Because of this tradition, artistic depictions of Bartholomew often show him holding a flaying knife or even carrying his own skin, emphasizing the brutal nature of his martyrdom. Other accounts suggest he was beaten, crucified upside down, and then flayed and beheaded, or that he was beaten unconscious and thrown into the sea before being killed. Some stories say he was simply beaten to death or crucified. What all these accounts agree on is that Bartholomew did not die peacefully of old age. He suffered a violent death for his faith. The uncertainty and variety in these accounts shows how difficult it was to preserve accurate historical records in the ancient world. But regardless of the exact details, Bartholomew's willingness to die for his faith demonstrates the same courage and commitment shown by his fellow apostles. 7. Matthew the tax collector turned gospel writer. Matthew has one of the most dramatic conversion stories among the apostles. Before following Jesus, Matthew, also called Levi, was a tax collector, which made him one of the most hated people in Jewish society. Tax collectors in Jesus' time didn't just collect taxes, they worked for the Roman Empire, collecting money from their own people to support the foreign occupiers. They were seen as traitors and thieves, often taking more money than required and keeping the extra for themselves. But when Jesus saw Matthew sitting at his tax collector's booth, he simply said, "Follow me." Matthew immediately left everything and followed Jesus. Then Matthew did something amazing. He threw a big dinner party at his house and invited Jesus along with many other tax collectors and sinners. The religious leaders were shocked that Jesus would eat with such people, but Jesus explained, "I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Matthew's conversion showed that no one is too far gone for God's forgiveness. Matthew went on to write one of the four Gospels, the first book in the New Testament. His Gospel was particularly aimed at Jewish readers, showing how Jesus fulfilled Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. The details of Matthew's death are largely unknown and disputed. Some traditions say he lived to old age and died peacefully. Others suggest he was martyred like most of his fellow apostles, with various accounts describing him being beheaded, stabbed, burned, or stoned to death. The uncertainty about Matthew's death reminds us that what matters most is not how these men died, but how they lived after meeting Jesus. Matthew's transformation from a despised tax collector to a beloved apostle and gospel writer shows the incredible power of Jesus to change lives. His story encourages us that no matter what our past looks like, Jesus can use us for great purposes when we decide to follow him. 8. Thomas. Doubting Thomas, who died for faith. Thomas is probably best known for his moment of doubt after Jesus' resurrection. When the other disciples told Thomas that Jesus had appeared to them, Thomas famously said, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." This moment earned him the nickname Doubting Thomas, but it's important to understand that Thomas wasn't being stubborn or faithless. He was being careful and honest about something that seemed impossible to believe. When Jesus did appear to Thomas and invited him to touch his wounds, Thomas immediately declared, "My Lord and my God." His doubt turned into one of the strongest declarations of faith in the entire New Testament. After Jesus' ascension, tradition tells us that Thomas traveled far from Jerusalem to spread the gospel. According to these accounts, he went all the way to India, where he preached and established churches. Thomas's death, according to tradition, occurred on July 3rd, 72 AD, in a place called Milapur in India. The story says that he was killed by being stabbed with spears, dying as a martyr for his faith. What's remarkable about Thomas's story is how consistent the traditions about his death are compared to some other apostles. Multiple sources agree on the basic details of how and where he died. Thomas's journey from doubt to faith to martyrdom teaches us several important lessons. First, it's okay to have questions and doubts. God can handle our honest struggles. Second, when our doubts are resolved, they can lead to even stronger faith. And third, sometimes those who doubt the most initially become the most committed believers. Thomas traveled thousands of miles from his homeland to tell people about Jesus and ultimately gave his life for that message. That's quite a transformation for someone who started out as Doubting Thomas. 9. James the son of Alphaeus, the lesser-known James. James the son of Alphaeus is sometimes called James the Less or James the Lesser, not because he was less important, but possibly because he was younger or shorter than James, the son of Zebedee. This James is one of the most mysterious apostles because the Bible tells us very little about him. The challenge with this James is that there were several men named James in the New Testament, and it's sometimes difficult to know which James is being talked about. Besides the two apostles named James, there was also James the brother of Jesus, who became a leader in the early church. Some people think James the son of Alphaeus might be the same person as James the brother of Jesus, but this isn't certain. The Bible doesn't give us enough clear information to know for sure. We do know that James the brother of Jesus died a violent death. According to historical accounts, he was thrown from the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem, then beaten with clubs and stoned to death. This happened because he refused to stop preaching about Jesus. As for James the son of Alphaeus, the traditions about his death vary. One account says he was crucified in Egypt while on a preaching mission. Another story claims he was stoned to death in Jerusalem, similar to what happened to James the brother of Jesus. The confusion about this James reminds us that the apostles were real people living in a real historical period, not just characters in a story. Sometimes historical records get mixed up or lost, especially when dealing with common names like James. What we can be confident about is that James the son of Alphaeus was chosen by Jesus to be one of the 12, which means Jesus saw something special in him. Whether he died peacefully or as a martyr, he was faithful to his calling as an apostle. 10. Jude Thaddeus, the apostle with many names. Jude is another apostle who went by several names, which has caused some confusion over the centuries. He's also called Thaddeus, Judas not Iscariot, and Lebes in different parts of the Bible. The reason Jude used the nickname Thaddeus was probably to distinguish himself from Judas Iscariot, the apostle who betrayed Jesus. Nobody wanted to be associated with that name after Judas's terrible betrayal. Some people think this Jude might have been Jesus' brother, since the Bible mentions that Jesus had a brother named Jude or Judas. However, this isn't certain, and many scholars believe they were different people. According to church tradition, Jude traveled far from his homeland to preach the gospel. Some accounts say he preached in various parts of the Middle East and possibly even as far as Persia, modern-day Iran. The most common tradition about Jude's death says that he was martyred alongside Simon the Zealot in the city of Beirut in modern-day Lebanon around 65 AD. At that time, Beirut was part of the Roman province of Syria. Religious artwork often shows Jude holding an axe, which symbolizes how he died. According to the tradition, both Jude and Simon were killed with axes by people who opposed their preaching. There's an interesting story about what happened to Jude's remains after his death. According to one account, his body was moved from Beirut to Rome in 1665 and placed in a special tomb at St. Peter's Basilica, where it was buried together with Simon the Zealot. Another story says his remains were kept at an Armenian monastery in Kurdistan until at least the 5th century. Archaeologists have even found an ancient burial box with the inscription Judas Thaddeus in Israel's Jezreel Valley, though we can't be certain it belonged to the apostle. Jude's multiple names and the various stories about his death show us how difficult it can be to preserve accurate historical records over many centuries. But what remains clear is that Jude was committed enough to his faith to travel far from home and ultimately give his life for it. 11. Simon the Zealot. The revolutionary turned apostle Simon the Zealot is another apostle about whom we know very little from the Bible itself. He appears only in the lists of the 12 apostles, with no stories about his personality or actions. The interesting thing about Simon is his nickname, the Zealot. This might tell us something important about his background. There was a Jewish political group called the Zealots who wanted to overthrow Roman rule in Palestine. They were basically freedom fighters or revolutionaries who used violence to resist the Roman occupation. If Simon had been part of this group before following Jesus, it would mean he had quite a transformation. He went from being someone who used violence to fight for political freedom to following Jesus, who taught love for enemies and peace. Another possibility is that Simon wasn't part of the political zealot movement, but was simply called the Zealot because he was zealous, very passionate about following Jewish law or about following Jesus. Early mistranslations of the Bible sometimes called Simon the Canaanite, which led to confusion and made some people think he was related to Jesus or was present at the wedding in Cana where Jesus turned water into wine. But modern scholars don't think this is accurate. According to various traditions, Simon preached in different places after Jesus' ascension. Some say he went to Egypt, others say Persia, and still others claim he preached in Britain or other parts of the Roman Empire. The stories about Simon's death are quite varied, which shows how uncertain the historical records are. Some traditions say he was martyred in Persia in 65 AD, possibly alongside Jude. Others claim he was crucified in Britain in 61 AD. Ethiopian Christians believe he was killed in Samaria, the central region of Israel. Another account says he was sawed in half, while Eastern traditions claim he died peacefully of old age in the ancient city of Odessa. Despite all this uncertainty about the details of Simon's life and death, what we can learn from his story is that Jesus calls people from all backgrounds, even former revolutionaries, to follow him and spread his message of love and peace. 12. Judas Iscariot, the betrayer's tragic end. Finally, we come to perhaps the most tragic figure among the 12 apostles, Judas Iscariot. Judas is remembered primarily for one terrible act, betraying Jesus to his enemies for 30 pieces of silver. What makes Judas's story so tragic is that he had the same opportunities as the other apostles. He lived with Jesus for 3 years, heard all his teachings, saw all his miracles, and was trusted enough to be the group's treasurer. Yet something went wrong in Judas's heart. The Bible tells us that Judas had been stealing money from the disciples' common fund. This shows that his betrayal of Jesus wasn't a sudden decision, but the result of a gradual moral decline. Small compromises with dishonesty led to the ultimate betrayal. When Judas agreed to help the chief priests arrest Jesus, he received 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave according to Old Testament law. He led the soldiers to the Garden of Gethsemane and identified Jesus with a kiss, a sign of friendship and respect that became the ultimate symbol of betrayal. But after Jesus was condemned to death, Judas was filled with remorse. He realized the terrible thing he had done and tried to return the money to the chief priests. When they refused to take it back, Judas threw the coins into the temple and went out and hanged himself. The Bible gives us 2 accounts of Judas's death that seemed different at first. Matthew says he hanged himself, while Acts says he fell in a field and his body burst open. Many scholars believe both accounts are true. Judas hanged himself, but later the rope broke or the branch gave way and his decomposing body fell and burst open when it hit the ground. There's also the question of who bought the field where Judas died. Matthew says the priests bought it with the returned money, while Acts says Judas bought it. The most likely explanation is that Judas had arranged to buy the field before his betrayal of Jesus, and the priests completed the transaction with The blood money. After his death, the field became known as the Field of Blood and was used as a burial place for foreigners and other outcasts. Judas's story serves as a warning about the dangers of greed, dishonesty, and gradually turning away from what we know is right. It also shows the difference between remorse and true repentance. Judas felt terrible about what he had done, but instead of seeking forgiveness, he chose despair and suicide. And there you have it, the incredible, inspiring, and sometimes heartbreaking stories of how the 12 apostles met their ends. From Peter's upside-down crucifixion to John's peaceful death in old age, from Thomas's spearing in India to Judas's tragic suicide, each story tells us something important about faith, courage, and the price of following Jesus. What strikes me most about these stories is the transformation we see in these men. They started as ordinary fishermen, tax collectors, and regular people with fears, doubts, and weaknesses. But their encounter with Jesus changed everything. Most of them went from running away when Jesus was arrested to boldly facing death for their faith. These weren't perfect people. Peter denied Jesus, Thomas doubted, Matthew had been a corrupt tax collector, and Simon may have been a violent revolutionary. But Jesus saw their potential and transformed their lives. Their willingness to die for their beliefs also tells us something important about the truth of Christianity. People might die for something they believe to be true, but they won't usually die for something they know is a lie. The fact that almost all of these men chose death rather than denying Jesus suggests they truly believed he had risen from the dead. Whether they died by crucifixion, beheading, stoning, or other means, their deaths were not the end of their stories. Their courage inspired others to follow Jesus, and the church they helped establish continues to grow around the world today. So, which apostle's story surprised you the most? Was it John's miraculous survival in boiling oil, Thomas's journey all the way to India, or perhaps the mystery surrounding some of the lesser-known apostles? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Which apostle would you most like to learn more about? And what do you think we can learn from their examples today? If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps us reach more people who love learning about these amazing stories. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos about biblical history, ancient mysteries, and fascinating stories from the past. We have so many more incredible stories to share with you, from the early church fathers to the great missionaries who changed the world. Your support means everything to us, and we can't wait to continue this journey through history together. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.